titled The Rise and Fall of Ancient Egypt, Every Century Rebuilt. Close your eyes, now open them. You are standing in darkness, but not the comfortable darkness of a room. This is the darkness of the desert at 3 in the morning, and the wind is moving. Sand strikes your face like small needles. The dunes shift and breathe around you, covering and uncovering things with the indifferent patience of something that has been doing this for thousands of years. Then, gradually, as your eyes adjust to the moonlight, you begin to see shapes. Massive shapes. Too regular to be natural. Too large to be anything a living person built yesterday. Stone
net is
edges
heavy.
emerging from the sand.
Good
A
catch.
carved face, enormous, serene, half buried, one eye still watching the horizon with an expression that has not changed in 4,000 years. You are standing at the edge of what was once the greatest civilization the ancient world had ever produced. It is gone now, or it seems gone, but the stones are still here. The carvings are still here. The mathematics built into the angles of these monuments, mathematics so precise that modern engineers study it with genuine humility, is still here, locked in rock, waiting. Egypt was not simply a kingdom. It was an argument, a permanent, monumental argument that human beings could defeat time, defeat death, and leave something behind that the universe itself could not erase. Before Egypt became legend, it ruled the ancient world. Before the pharaohs, before the pyramids, before the gold and the gods and the towering stone faces, there was the river, the Nile. And the Nile was everything. It is approximately 5000 BC. The
Rise, my
Sahara
people.
Desert is expanding.
Hear the words of your
This
Pharaoh.
is the real climate
By the
catastrophe
gods, I
of the
decree
ancient
prosperity
world.
and
A
order.
slow drying that pushed human populations east and north
Let it be so.
toward the last reliable water source in the region. They came to the Nile because they had nowhere else to go. What they found was terrifying and generous in equal measure. Every year, the river flooded, violently, unpredictably, rising over its banks and drowning everything nearby. And every year, when it retreated, it left behind something extraordinary, a thick layer of dark, rich silt that turned the strip of land beside the river into the most fertile growing ground in the ancient world. In the desert, in a landscape where the sun kills almost everything, there was this one thin line of miraculous green. People learned to read the river the way we read weather. They watched the stars to anticipate the flood timing. They planted immediately after the retreat. They harvested quickly before the next rising. Their entire calendar, their entire religion, their entire understanding of time was organized around this one annual rhythm of water. They did not worship the Nile by accident. They worshipped it because without it, they simply did not exist. Around 3100 BC, something happened that no one fully understands because the people who lived through it left records that are still being decoded. Two separate kingdoms, which had developed along different stretches of the Nile, became one. Upper Egypt, the southern portion, whose symbol was the white crown, and Lower Egypt, the northern delta region, whose symbol was the red crown, were unified under a single ruler. His name, most historians believe, was Narmer, or possibly Menes. The records are ancient enough that certainty is difficult. But the Narmer palette, a carved ceremonial stone tablet discovered in the 19th century, shows a king wearing both crowns, striking a defeated enemy, standing above a unified country. The double crown became the symbol of Egyptian kingship from that moment forward. More significant than the symbol was the idea beneath it. The idea that a ruler could be both human and divine, a living god, the earthly embodiment of Horus, the falcon deity, was not simply political mythology. It was the organizing principle of a civilization. It answered a question that every society must answer. Why should anyone obey? Egypt's answer was because the person commanding you is not merely a person. He is the bridge between the world of the living and the world of the gods. Obey the pharaoh, and you obey the order of the universe itself. It was the most powerful political idea the ancient world had yet produced. The pharaohs did not simply rule. They performed. Every action, every ritual, every public appearance was a demonstration of divine authority, staged with the precision and grandeur of an eternal ceremony. They wore specific crowns for specific occasions. They carried specific symbols, the crook, the flail, that encoded their dual role as shepherd and judge of their people. They underwent elaborate rituals at specific temples on specific days determined by a sacred calendar aligned with the stars. When a pharaoh died, the process of preparing them for the afterlife was so complex, so expensive, and so central to the culture's deepest beliefs that it consumed enormous resources for months. Because in Egypt, death was not an ending. Death was a doorway. The Egyptians believed with a certainty that shaped every decision of their civilization that the soul survived the body, that there was an afterlife, a field of reeds, a paradise, that the worthy could reach if their body was preserved, if the proper words were spoken, if the correct offerings were made. The pyramid texts, carved inside the burial chambers of the oldest pyramids, are the oldest religious writings in the world. They are instructions. Turn left here. Say this word. Offer this gift. The map to a destination no living person had confirmed existed, and yet an entire civilization organized its every institution around the belief that it did. The pyramids did not appear fully formed. They evolved, and the evolution tells a story. The first monumental royal tombs were mastabas, flat-topped rectangular structures of mud brick, modest by later standards, but already demonstrating the Egyptian belief that the dead king needed a permanent physical home. Then came the step pyramid of Djoser, built around 2650 BC by the architect Imhotep, a name so revered that he was eventually deified. The step pyramid was a mastaba placed on top of a mastaba placed on top of another, rising in 6 stages toward the sky like a staircase for the soul. Then the bent pyramid at Dashur, an experiment. Its angle changed midway through construction when engineers realized the original slope was too steep. And then, around 2560 BC, the Great Pyramid of Khufu at Giza. It stands 146 meters high in its original form. It contains approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing between 2.5 and 15 tons. It was the tallest structure on Earth for nearly 4,000 years. The precision of its alignment to true north is within a fraction of a single degree, better than many modern buildings. The people who built it were not slaves, as legend has long claimed. They were fed, housed, and cared for. We know this from the workers' village discovered nearby. They were Egyptians building a monument for their god-king, building eternity with their hands. Stand at the base of the Great Pyramid and look up. This is important. Do not look at a photograph. Close your eyes and imagine it. The sheer weight of it rising above you, block after block, each one placed by a human being who woke up that morning and ate bread and had a name. The top, in its completion, was capped with a pyramidion, possibly sheathed in electrum, a gold-silver alloy that caught the first light of dawn and threw it back across the desert like a signal fire to the gods. The complex at Giza was not a single pyramid. It was 3 major pyramids, smaller satellite pyramids, a valley temple, a causeway, and, watching over all of it, the Great Sphinx, carved from a natural limestone outcrop, facing east, its expression unreadable across 4,500 years. These were not simply tombs. They were theological statements made in stone. They said, "Our king was a god. Our civilization stands at the center of the universe, and we built something permanent enough to prove it." There is a reason the Great Pyramid is the only one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world that still stands. It was built by people who understood, at a level that still exceeds comfortable explanation, what permanent means. Nothing lasts without cost. The Old Kingdom, the age of the pyramid builders, began to fracture around 2180 BC. The causes were multiple and interconnected in the way that real collapses always are. No single villain, no single catastrophic event, but a slow accumulation of pressure on a system that had been running at its limit. Climate change played a role. A period of severe drought reduced the Nile floods, destroyed harvests, and produced famines so severe that later texts record what no civilization wants to write down. Cannibalism. Starvation in the shadow of monuments built to last forever. The central government weakened as regional governors, the nomarchs, accumulated power and resources that should have flowed to the pharaoh. The ideology of divine kingship frayed when the god-king could not make the river rise. What god cannot feed his people? What deity watches his worshippers starve? The inscriptions from this period, the first intermediate period, historians call it, a neutral name for a catastrophe, carry a desperation that the earlier periods do not. A man writes, "The corn has gone. The cattle are dead. I do not know what will happen tomorrow." The pyramids still stood above all of it, massive, silent, already ancient, already beginning to be stripped for stone by people who needed something to build with, more urgently than they needed a monument to a king who had failed them. Egypt did not die. That is the thing. That is the extraordinary specific thing about this civilization that sets it apart from almost everything that came before it. It collapsed and it rebuilt. The first intermediate period lasted about a century and a half. Then, around 2055 BC, a ruler from Thebes, the city in Upper Egypt that would become one of the most important in the ancient world, reunified the country. His name was Mentuhotep II. He waged wars, absorbed the fractured regional powers, and restored something that had been lost. Not just political unity, but the story. The story that Egypt told itself about itself, that the pharaoh was divine, that the Nile was eternal. That order, the concept the Egyptians called Ma'at, usually translated as truth, justice, and cosmic balance, was the fundamental principle of the universe,
I am
and
the
that Egypt's
eternal
role was to
Pharaoh.
maintain it.
Rise
The
and
Middle
witness the
Kingdom that
dawn of my
followed was
eternal
not
kingdom.
simply a restoration.
My will
It was in
is the
some
will
ways
of the
more
gods.
sophisticated, more humane than what had come before. Literature flourished. The story of Sinuhe, one of the earliest works of narrative fiction in human history, was written in this period. Art became more emotionally expressive. The faces on statues began to show something the Old Kingdom faces rarely did: wariness, doubt, the specific, particular look of a person who has survived something and is trying to understand what survival means. The New Kingdom, beginning around 1550 BC, after Egypt's second major crisis and reunification, produced the Egypt of legend. This was the Egypt of warrior pharaohs, of chariots and empire, of campaigns that reached deep into modern-day Syria and Sudan. The army that Egypt fielded in this period was transformed from a domestic force into a professional, internationally competitive military machine. The chariot, adopted from the Hyksos invaders who had demonstrated its devastating effectiveness, became the core of Egyptian offensive warfare. Archers firing composite bows from moving chariots could devastate infantry before they could engage. The Egyptians combined this with disciplined foot soldiers, siege technology, and the logistical capability to supply armies operating hundreds of miles from the Nile. Thutmose III is perhaps the greatest military commander this period produced, a ruler who conducted 17 successful campaigns in 20 years and pushed Egyptian authority further than it had ever reached. He has been called the Napoleon of ancient Egypt, which is slightly backward given the chronology, but captures something real about the scale of his ambition and achievement. His armies marched through what is now Lebanon, Israel, and Syria, bringing back tribute, prisoners, rare woods, and the continuous demonstration that Egypt was not merely a river kingdom. Egypt was the dominant power of the known world. The sun disk of Aten had not yet risen. The age of gold was not yet at its peak. At its height, the New Kingdom's Egypt was the most magnificent civilization on earth. Walk through Thebes, the great southern capital, at the height of its power, and try to hold what you are seeing. The temples of Karnak, under continuous construction for over 1,000 years, covering a space larger than several European cathedrals combined. The Avenue of Sphinxes connecting Karnak to the Luxor Temple, a processional road lined with stone guardians that stretched for nearly 2 miles. The Valley of the Kings cut into the limestone cliffs above the city, a necropolis of extraordinary luxury, its tombs painted floor to ceiling with a vividness that centuries underground have barely dimmed. Gold everywhere. Not as decoration, as theology. Gold was the flesh of the sun god Ra. A golden surface was a surface touched by divinity. The temples gleamed, the statues shone. Obelisks tipped with electrum sent light flying across the Nile at dawn. And behind all of it, behind the gold and the temples and the military victories, the river. Still flooding, still retreating, still leaving its black gift of fertile silt on the banks, still being read by farmers who planted in its wake and harvested its generosity and prayed to Osiris and Isis and Horus with the simple faith of people who had watched their gods deliver, year after year, the miracle of life in the middle of a desert. In approximately 1353 BC, a pharaoh came to power who would shatter everything. His original name was Amenhotep IV. He changed it to Akhenaten, meaning beneficial to Aten, because he intended to remake Egyptian religion from its foundation. The Aten was the sun disk, not simply a sun god, but the pure abstract energy of the sun itself, accessible without priests, without temples, without the complex pantheon of gods that had organized Egyptian spiritual life for 2,000 years. Akhenaten closed the temples. He confiscated the estates of the priesthood, particularly the enormously powerful priests of Amun at Karnak. He moved the capital to a new city he built from scratch in the desert at a place now called Amarna. He changed Egyptian art. Suddenly figures bent and moved and showed human proportion in ways the formal art of Egypt never had. He had a wife named Nefertiti, whose beauty, 4,000 years later, still has the power to stop people in museum corridors. He may have been a visionary. He may have been a paranoid megalomaniac. He may have been both. What he produced was chaos. By the time he died, or disappeared, the end of his reign is still debated. The empire he had inherited was damaged. The military had been neglected. Foreign allies were sending desperate letters to a pharaoh who was too absorbed in religious revolution to respond. The traditional gods had been suppressed. Ma'at had been broken. After Akhenaten came a child, a very young boy, perhaps 9 years old at his coronation, perhaps younger, who was placed on the throne of the most powerful empire on earth and surrounded by advisors and priests who were in reality running the country while he served as the divine face on a complicated political restoration. His name, when he took the throne, was Tutankhamun, living image of Aten. His advisors changed it almost immediately to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, which told you everything about what they were undoing. He reigned for approximately 10 years. He restored the old gods. He returned the capital to Thebes. He was, in political terms, a vehicle for a counter-revolution. He died around age 18 or 19. The cause is still debated: malaria, a bone disease, a chariot accident, perhaps a combination. He was buried in the Valley of the Kings in a tomb that for a pharaoh was surprisingly modest. His burial goods were hastily assembled, suggesting his death was unexpected. And then, sand. Silence. 3,000 years of sand. Until 1922, when a British archaeologist named Howard Carter found the sealed door in the valley floor and opened it and held a candle to the darkness and was asked by his assistant whether he could see anything. And Carter said, in what may be the greatest understatement in the history of archaeology, "Yes, wonderful things." A generation after the chaos of Akhenaten, Egypt found the ruler it needed. Ramses II came to the throne around 1279 BC and proceeded to do something almost unreasonable. He reigned for 66 years. He was approximately 90 years old when he died, which in a world where life expectancy was roughly 35 years, was so extraordinary that later generations assumed he must have been divine simply because no ordinary human being could last that long. In those 66 years, he fought wars, built more monuments than any other pharaoh in Egyptian history, sired approximately 100 children, and ensured that his name was carved so many times on so many surfaces that he has become, essentially, impossible to erase. His most famous military engagement, the Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites around 1274 BC, ended in a stalemate that both sides claimed as victory. The subsequent treaty between Egypt and the Hittites is the oldest surviving peace treaty in human history. Ramses built Abu Simbel, 2 rock temples carved directly into a cliff face in Nubia, the larger featuring 4 seated statues of himself 65 feet high. When modern Egypt built the Aswan Dam in the 1960s and the temples were threatened by rising water, an international effort moved them, block by block, to higher ground. Even the modern world could not bear to let Ramses disappear. But time moves even through stone. After Ramses, after the decades of his reign, and the long, slow decline of the dynasty he had personified, Egypt began to feel something it had always fought against and never fully prevented: weakness. The successors of Ramses could not hold what he had built. The treasury had been depleted by decades of warfare and monumental construction. The administrative system that had held the empire together was increasingly corrupted. Officials diverting resources, priests accumulating power that rivaled the throne, regional officials behaving more like independent rulers than servants of a divine king. The tomb robbers became bolder. The Valley of the Kings had always been a target. The burial goods inside were worth more than most people would earn in several lifetimes. But by the late New Kingdom, tomb robbery had become almost systematic. Priests eventually removed the royal mummies from their original tombs and hid them in communal caches, which is why many of them survive today, stripped of their original burial goods but physically preserved. By 1069 BC, the New Kingdom had ended. The Third Intermediate Period, another fragmentation, another age of divided authority, had begun. Egypt was no longer producing kings who commanded the respect that Ramses had commanded. The Nile still flooded, the crops still grew, but something in the center of things had gone hollow. The Sea Peoples arrived like a question the Bronze Age could not answer. Around 1200 BC, the same period that saw the collapse of the Hittite Empire, the Mycenaean Greek civilization, and several other major Eastern Mediterranean powers in what historians call the Late Bronze Age collapse, waves of migrating peoples struck Egypt's northern and western borders. Who they were is still debated. Where they came from is still uncertain. What they did is clear. They overwhelmed the defenses of multiple civilizations in a span of decades, contributing to one of the most dramatic reorganizations of the ancient world. Ramses III, one of the last genuinely powerful pharaohs, repelled them in two major engagements recorded in vivid detail on the walls of his temple at Medinet Habu. The naval battle depicted there is the earliest
Envoys of
recorded
Rome,
sea
what
battle
message
in
do you
history.
bring?
Great
Egypt
Queen, a treaty from
survived,
Caesar to
but
unite our
surviving was no
empires.
longer the same
me
as
see it.
thriving. The
It is
empire
fair,
in
Your Majesty.
Canaan was gone.
We shall
The
consider it.
trade networks that had sustained Egyptian wealth were disrupted. The treasury, again, was strained. Soldiers went unpaid. Around 1170 BC, Egyptian history records the first known labor strike. Workers building a royal tomb in the Valley of the Kings stopped work because their grain rations had not arrived. They sat down. They refused to move. In the most powerful civilization on earth, the workers had run out of faith that the system would take care of them. After the great dynasties, foreign rulers. This was the thing Egypt had always resisted. The thing its entire national mythology was constructed around avoiding. Egypt was the center. Egypt was divine. Egypt was the ordered world surrounded by chaos. Foreign rule was the incarnation of that chaos wearing a crown. But it came anyway. The Libyans first. They had been settling in the Delta region for generations, and by the 10th century BC, several Libyan families had become so integrated into Egyptian power structures that their members became pharaohs. Then the Nubians, ironically, the people Egyptians had long conquered and administered, swept north around 747 BC and established the 25th dynasty, with kings who were more devoutly Egyptian in their cultural practice than many ethnic Egyptians had recently been. Then the Assyrians, in 671 BC, invaded and sacked Thebes, the first time that city had fallen in its entire history. The Assyrian king had the Theban temples stripped of their accumulated gold. When you see a list of what was taken, it reads like the inventory of a civilization being emptied. Then the Persians, under Cambyses II in 525 BC, Egypt absorbed into the Achaemenid Empire as a province, reduced from the center of the world to a territory to be administered. Each foreign ruler adopted Egyptian titles, wore Egyptian crowns, commissioned Egyptian temples. They understood, all of them, that Egypt's power was also its mythology, and that mythology was worth wearing. Then came Alexander. In 332 BC, the young Macedonian king, 24 years old, already master of Greece and Persia, arrived at the gates of Egypt. He did not need to fight. The Persian garrison surrendered. The Egyptians, with the theological flexibility of a people who had absorbed foreign rulers before, received him as a liberator and recognized him as pharaoh. Alexander made the journey to the Oracle of Amun at the Siwa oasis in the western desert, a grueling trek through hundreds of miles of sand, and the priests confirmed what he may have already believed: he was the son of a god. He founded a city on the Mediterranean coast, Alexandria, with the characteristic speed and ambition of a man who moved through the world as though he was in a hurry to mark it before he ran out of time. He was right to hurry. He died at 32. But Alexandria lived. Under the Ptolemaic dynasty, the Greek rulers who inherited Egypt after Alexander's death. The city became one of the greatest in the ancient world. The Library of Alexandria, at its height, may have held 500,000 scrolls. The Lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, guided ships through the Mediterranean night. Egypt was Greek in its governance, but Egyptian in its temples, in its religion, in the deep continuity of its agricultural civilization beside the eternal river. She was the last. Cleopatra VII, the final ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the last independent pharaoh of Egypt, a woman whose actual historical significance is so much larger than the stories about her beauty have traditionally allowed. She spoke 9 languages, including Egyptian. She was reportedly the first of the Ptolemaic rulers to bother learning the language of the people they had governed for 3 centuries. She was a trained mathematician and philosopher. She understood, with complete clarity, the situation she had inherited: a weakened kingdom, a divided dynasty, and Rome, enormous, hungry, increasingly dominant Rome, circling just offshore. She formed alliances with the most powerful Romans of her era, Julius Caesar, then Mark Antony, not from romantic recklessness, but from the strategic calculation of a ruler who understood that Egypt's only hope of survival was to position itself as Rome's necessary partner rather than its available conquest. She was brilliant. She was not brilliant enough. Rome was too large. The forces arrayed against her were too powerful. When Octavian's forces defeated Mark Antony at Actium in 31 BC, and the end became certain, Cleopatra, according to the ancient accounts, died by her own hand rather than walk in chains through Rome's streets. She was 39 years old. With her death, 3,000 years of pharaonic civilization ended, not with a battle, with a woman who refused to be a trophy. In 30 BC, Egypt became a Roman province. The temples were still maintained, Rome was pragmatic about local religion, and the Egyptian gods had admirers throughout the empire. The Nile still flooded. Grain from Egypt fed a significant portion of the Roman Empire's population. Egypt was called the breadbasket of Rome, and Rome guarded it accordingly. But the living tradition of Egyptian civilization, the unbroken chain of priests who memorized the rituals, of scribes who could read the hieroglyphs, of communities organized around the great temple complexes, was fraying. The old knowledge was becoming specialized, then rare, then extinct. By the 4th century AD, with Christianity spreading through the Roman Empire and the old gods being actively suppressed, the last Egyptian priests who could read hieroglyphics were aging men keeping a language alive in the small spaces the New World left them. In 394 AD, the last known hieroglyphic inscription was carved. After that, silence. A language that had recorded the ambitions, prayers, complaints, love letters, tax records, medical manuals, and creation myths of a civilization across 3,000 years became unreadable. Not translated incorrectly, not misunderstood, simply unknown, locked inside its own symbols. The key had been lost. The sand continued its patient work. The monuments remained, but the voices inside them had gone quiet. Egypt had become what it had always feared becoming, not dead, but forgotten. In 1799, a French soldier digging a fortification near the Egyptian city of Rosetta found a stone. It was carved with 3 scripts, hieroglyphics, Demotic, and Ancient Greek, all saying the same thing. It took scholars 23 years to decode it fully. When Jean-François Champollion finally cracked the hieroglyphic system in 1822, it was as though a door had been sealed for 14 centuries and someone had found in the dust the key. The voices came back, slowly, then in a flood, the prayers of the pyramid texts, the love poems of the New Kingdom, the medical papyri with their precise observations about the human body, the administrative records of farmers, bureaucrats, and soldiers, the words of Akhenaten's hymn to the Aten, words written by a man trying to describe the experience of sunlight on skin 3,000 years before anyone alive was born. Howard Carter's discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 brought the ancient world into the modern one in ways that still have not fully settled. We look at the golden mask and feel something that does not require explanation. Something older than language. Recognition, maybe. The understanding that the person who wore that mask was a human being, young, uncertain, surrounded by powers larger than himself, trying to live and afraid to die. just like everyone who has ever existed. Empires vanished, kings faded, but ancient Egypt became eternal, not because its monuments endured, but because its humanity did.